yawning darkness of Westminster Abbey, a resting place for dynasties long since fallen, lies a secret that has never been fully told. A lead-sealed coffin, locked away for 265 years, contained not just the body of a queen, but perhaps the most horrifying chemical laboratory in the history of the British monarchy. People once believed that embalming was a way to preserve eternity, but what happened to Elizabeth I stands as a chilling testament to the betrayal of that very technique. Her body was not preserved, it was transformed, corrupted, cooked by the very substances meant to protect it. And when Victorian investigators first opened that coffin on a gray October morning in 1868, they did not simply enter a tomb. They stepped into a nightmare, a space where wax, wigs, decaying flesh, and ancient spices had fused into a grotesque amalgam, so revolting that some nearly lost their minds. This is not merely a tale of a dead queen. It is a journey into the very limits of power, flesh, and a chilling truth no one escapes, that all glory, no matter how richly wrapped in velvet and gold, eventually rots. And Elizabeth, the woman who once proclaimed she had the heart and stomach of a king, became the greatest victim of the immortality she so desperately tried to preserve. Westminster Abbey, England's most sacred cathedral, also hides some of the darkest secrets in royal history. In 1868, after more than 2 centuries, in which no one dared disturb the royal crypt, a bold decision was made. Dean Arthur Stanley, head of the Abbey, ordered the sealed vault containing the remains of Elizabeth I and Mary I half-sisters and bitter political rivals to be opened. No one on the excavation team that morning could have anticipated what they were about to face. As the final stone was lifted, a rush of icy air thick with the stench of mold and rot rose from the depths. The team, equipped only with basic tools, oil lamps, cloths for their faces, and the belief that they were serving history, descended into the darkness. But what they found below was not a dry, orderly crypt with pristine coffins. It was chaos. Groundwater had seeped through the stone walls, rotting the wood and lead. Many coffins had collapsed, their contents dissolving into an unrecognizable slurry of bone, cloth, and royal flesh. Nobles who once wielded immense power now lay tangled together like forgotten corpses with no names. When the team finally reached the location believed to house Elizabeth I's resting place, they were stunned. Her coffin and that of Mary had fused together. Centuries of pressure from stone and the chemistry of decay had melded the 2 lead caskets of bitter, cosmic irony that condemned 2 rival queens to share an eternal prison of death. Separating them was no easy task. Workers brought in metal saws, carefully cutting along the oxidized seams. Then, as the lead gave way, a burst of toxic gas erupted, followed by a sound that many would never forget. A sharp, inhuman hiss, like a death rattle from the earth itself. Some screamed. Others vomited. One man collapsed from asphyxiation. Nothing had prepared them for what lay inside. The body had liquefied into a black, gelatinous mass. And yet, in the glinting lamplight, they could still see tufts of false red hair, a tattered velvet shroud, and fragments of a shattered skull, all suspended in the mire like relics of a drowned queen. But perhaps the most horrifying part was the sound, faint knocking, soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from within the crypt for days. At first, the team thought it was just falling debris or tools shifting. But even during quiet moments, long after work had stopped, the knocking persisted, regular and deliberate, as if someone or something was inside, asking to be let out. Evan Dean Stanley, a man of reason and theology, later wrote in his private journal, "There was a presence, not of spirit, but of something unholy pressing against our senses. Over. Historians later attributed the noise to gas buildup within the coffin, or chemical reactions from the embalmed remains. But those who were present that week never believed such explanations. Some members of the team resigned immediately, refusing to ever set foot in the abbey again. A few fled London altogether. They had not merely unearthed a corpse. They had cracked open a silence that time itself had tried to bury, and what spilled out was not glory, nor legacy, but truth. A truth so ghastly the monarchy had buried it for centuries, that death spares no crown. And sometimes it comes back with vengeance. Before becoming a decomposing corpse in the dark, Elizabeth I endured a slow death, one that carried both the tragic grandeur of a sovereign and the primal fear of a human being facing extinction. In the winter of 1603, at Richmond Palace, the Queen of England's golden age refused to lie down. She stood for days on end, clutching the arm of her chair, eyes wide open, neither sleeping nor eating. She believed that the moment her back touched the bed, her soul would slip away. And so, she stood, even as her strength faded. She was held up by pillows and the arms of her ladies in waiting. But Elizabeth would not fall, as if resisting for just a few more hours might allow her to outlast fate itself. Her attendants whispered that she murmured incoherently, sometimes calling out to her mother Anne Boleyn, who had been beheaded by Elizabeth's own father. At times, she would sit in eerie silence for hours, staring into nothingness, as if seeing something no one else could. In a bedchamber thick with the scent of melting candles, people began to fear her, not as a monarch, but as a living ghost. Her body by then was no longer Gloriana's, the queen who had once commanded Europe's attention. The face, once immortalized in poems and portraits, had become a cracked mask. The white lead makeup clung to her skin in patchy flakes, like lime on a corpse. Her lips, once painted in deep crimson, were dry and split, revealing blackened, decaying teeth, the toll of a lifetime addicted to sugar. But the most horrifying symptom, the one that terrified Elizabeth herself, was the abscess in her throat, what royal physicians called the royal disease. It rendered her unable to swallow or eat. And, according to one doctor's journal, her breath carried the scent of her own death. In that moment when Elizabeth I was finally forced to confront reality, to recognize that power could no longer shield her, she ceased to be a symbol. She was simply an old, frail woman, trembling in fear. And in that hour, ghosts of the past returned with terrifying clarity. She remembered her mother hurriedly buried in an arrow chest after her execution. She remembered her father, Henry VIII, whose body had swollen so grotesquely in death that it exploded inside his coffin. Elizabeth knew exactly what happened to royal bodies. She knew that after death, she would not be left to rest, but cut open, dissected, her majesty stripped away, her corpse laid bare beneath the knives of the embalmer. And so, Elizabeth I issued a final command: let no one touch my body. But like most deathbed pleas, it was ignored. Because once the crown passed to another head, a monarch's corpse becomes ritual procedure, a body to be managed. And that procedure began the moment she collapsed. At 3:00 a.m. on the 24th of March, 1603, no weeping, no sacred rite, just a queen alone, standing until her body could no longer endure, and finally falling, reduced to a technical task awaiting completion. A golden era did not end with fanfare or drums, but with a soft, sickening crack as her body met the cold stone floor. The moment Elizabeth I drew her final breath, her body no longer belonged to her. Within minutes, the white glove of sovereign power was replaced by hands wielding scalpels and hot wax. Those who once bowed before the queen now stepped aside, giving way to physicians, surgeons, and embalmers, the very men who would, quite literally, tear her apart piece by piece. It was a long-standing ritual in the Tudor monarchy to treat the royal corpse not as a sacred vessel, but as an object to be processed. And yet, what they did to Elizabeth was not preservation, it was execution after death. The process began with stripping away her royal garments. Beneath the silk and velvet was a body swollen with disease and blistered by decades of toxic lead-based cosmetics. As the makeup was washed off, a face emerged that no longer resembled Elizabeth's skin, as thin as parchment. Darkened vines, blackened lips, and teeth reduced to jagged remnants. Even the most seasoned embalmers were unsettled. Then came the first incision, a clean slice beneath the ribcage. They opened her chest like a trunk. Blood, rot, and foul gas escaped. The stench was beyond masking with incense. One attendant fainted on the spot and had to be carried away. Heart, liver, intestines, kidneys, each organ was removed and dropped into wooden basins filled with strong wine and pungent herbs. But this was not medicine. This was ritualized brutality. Her brain, the seat of a mind that had outmaneuvered kings, was broken apart and drawn out through the nose, with a long metal rod driven through the skull. Spatters of liquefied brain matter hit the floor, mixing with the heavy scent of decayed blood and ancient resins. Once the abdominal cavity was empty, it was stuffed with a grotesque blend of resin, myrrh, cinnamon bark, vinegar, wine, and sawdust, more like seasoning a goose for Christmas than preparing a sovereign for eternal rest. Then they crudely stitched the body shut with coarse thread, large seams crossing her belly like the hem of a sack. The corpse was then redressed in layers of silk, a red gown, and a fur-lined cloak masking the carnage that had just taken place. But her face could not be salvaged. It had collapsed, contorted, and cracked. So they rebuilt it literally. A mask of wax was sculpted over her features, reshaped to match her painted portraits. A vibrant red wig, still intact from her days on the throne, was fastened atop her head. From a distance, she looked like a sleeping queen. But up close, she was a doll, a counterfeit corpse, a horror piece masquerading as England's monarch. And then she was placed into a lead coffin, an inch-thick sarcophagus, sealed tight, as if the world itself wished to lock away the truth. But they were wrong. What they entombed that day was not just a body, but a ticking nightmare, a chemical reactor, beginning its slow fermentation. From that moment on, Westminster Abbey was no longer merely sacred ground. It became a crypt of secrets too terrifying to confront. And Elizabeth, she did not rest. She was cooked alive slowly, in the very dream of immortality she had so desperately clung to. On the day of Elizabeth I's funeral, they said London wept. Thousands of mourners crowded the streets, braving the spring rain, bowing their heads to bid farewell to the queen who had reigned for 45 years. But as sobs echoed from the grieving crowd, a far more brutal truth was being hidden beneath the purple velvet that shrouded her coffin, because inside, Elizabeth's body had already begun to decompose it more horrifically than any royal funeral had ever witnessed. The thick, lead-lined coffin, sealed to defy time, had become a death trap, with no release for the internal gases, the chemicals from her stuffed abdomen, embalming herbs, and waxed face began to react violently. Pressure built hour by hour, turning the coffin into a royal pressure cooker on the verge of eruption. Private records from the court revealed this chilling detail during the 4-hour procession to Westminster Abbey. Royal attendants, had to secretly drill tiny holes into the coffin to vent the gas. Each time, the openings were hastily resealed with molten lead before anyone in the crowd could catch a whiff of the truth. No one spoke of it, but many in the escort began to avoid the coffin. The stench, a sickening blend of rotting flesh, incense, resin, and slow-cooked skin, clung to the air. A nearby priest grew dizzy and vomited blood. A royal guard collapsed. Officially, these were written off as overcome by emotion. But they knew better. Death was screaming from beneath the royal shroud. The coffin, carried by horse-drawn carriage and draped in rich purple velvet, was topped with a lifelike wax effigy of Elizabeth dressed in red royal robes, holding the jeweled scepter, crowned with glory, and wearing a faint, sculpted smile. From afar, the people believed she still reigned peaceful, eternal, but those close enough reported hearing a faint hiss, a soft rattle from within. Sounds as if something or someone was moving inside. Father Anthony, who presided over the burial, later confessed in a private letter, "I stood near the coffin as it was lowered into the crypt, and I heard something crack, a dry, brittle snap like ruptured metal. Then a light puff of gas escaped, as if hell itself had exhaled. But when the coffin was lowered into the royal vault, a distinct cracking sound was heard, perhaps the lead giving way, or perhaps the decomposing body within collapsing under its own liquefied weight. No one spoke of it again. The court quickly ended the ceremony, sealed the vault beneath heavy stone, and imposed a strict order of silence on all witnesses. The official record simply stated a solemn, tearful farewell to a beloved sovereign, Vezin, but the unofficial accounts, torn letters, hidden diary, pages tell a different story. That on the very day England bowed to honor its greatest ruler, her body was rotting, silently rupturing beneath the folds of velvet and golden-threaded funeral robes. No matter how meticulously crafted the spectacle, no glory can mask the stench of death. And Elizabeth, the legendary queen, was not returned to the earth in majesty, but in silence and stench, as prayers rose only to drown out the soft moans of decay. That funeral marked not just the end of a monarch, it was the beginning of a deathly secret, sealed for 2 centuries, waiting patiently to be unearthed. After the funeral, the heavy stone doors of the royal crypt at Westminster Abbey were sealed shut. A cold slab bearing the inscription, Elizabeth Regina, lay quietly among the countless symbols of monarchy. No one spoke of her body again. Not a word was uttered about the stench, the hissing, or the strange reactions inside the lead coffin. It was as if a blood-soaked chapter had been forcibly closed, buried beneath the earth forever. And so it remained, untouched for 265 years. No one dared reopen the tomb. No one. Until i dusinne og 838, when Dean Arthur Stanley ordered the vault unearthed. He was not in search of mysteries. His aim was simple: to verify the burial order of the monarchs. But the moment the first chisel pierced the thick limestone, a strange, cold vapor rose from below. The workers replaced their lanterns with candles, but the flames flickered, dimmed, and sputtered, as though the air had been tainted since the previous century. They were not merely opening a chamber, they were unlocking a pressurized vessel of history, a place where flesh and time had fused into something that no longer belonged to the realm of reality. As the final steps were cleared, they descended into a shadowed room where rotting stone, seeping water, and collapsed coffins lay scattered like sunken ships. At the center lay the coffins of Elizabeth and Mary fused together, their lead linings melded by pressure and decay. Fate had bound 2 bitter rivals in death, their enmity sealed in cold metal, Investigators later recalled that when Mary's coffin was lifted to access Elizabeth's, a faint hiss escaped once more. No one dared speak. But their eyes all shared the same question. What are we doing? Then they lifted the lid. It was not a mummified queen, as they had imagined, not the ivory skeletons they had read about, but a grotesque amalgam blackened flesh, soft and tar-like from centuries of moisture, a red wig still perfectly curled, askew atop a collapsed skull, wax, resins, and decaying tissue fused into a gelatinous mass that clung to fragmented bone. One medical examiner fainted. Another collapsed, vomiting blood, and had to be carried out. But the horror didn't end there. In one corner of the coffin, they discovered a small silver box, sealed tight. Inside was a crystal deep red-purple, sharp, and glinting like a precious gem. But chemical analysis revealed the truth. It was Elizabeth's heart, fossilized by the mingling of mercury, lead, and putrefied fluids. The very heart that once carried an empire had become a beautiful, deadly stone. The toxic gases trapped inside methane, hydrogen sulfide, and unknown organic compounds caused hallucinations, panic attacks, even insomnia. In the weeks that followed, several members of the team claimed that at night, in dreams, they could still hear moaning, knocking from beneath the abbey. Dean Stanley, who led the excavation, never permitted another royal vault to be opened again in his lifetime. In his journal, he wrote, "We have touched something beyond history. Not a queen, but the shape of death itself." From that moment on, Westminster Abbey was no longer just the echoing chamber of royal hymns. It became a living tomb, a building of stone, but soaked in flesh, blood, gas, and the decaying dreams of those who once imagined themselves immortal. And Elizabeth I, in her astonishing state of decomposition, became something no one in history had foreseen. An eternal symbol not of glory, but of absolute rot. The body of Elizabeth I, after more than 2 centuries buried beneath the earth, did not merely decay. It became a chemical reaction with no precedent in the medical history of the British monarchy. And what investigators found inside her coffin beyond the grotesque was a silent, chilling declaration: it is science, not sovereignty, that triumphs in the end. The anatomists on the excavation team struggled to remain composed as they documented their findings. They collected samples, crystallized skin fragments, wax mixed with coagulated blood, flecks of dyed red wig, and crystalline formations that had once been human organs. Some tissues remained strangely intact, preserved by layers of resin and herbs. Others had rotted into unrecognizable slush. It was a scene of contradictions, preservation, and decay coexisting in a single body. Chemical analysis revealed a lethal cocktail: mercury, white lead, arsenic, camphor, and wine infused with royal spices. The sealed environment of the coffin prevented evaporation. Instead, the toxins recirculated through the tissues, creating what scientists later called recursive putrefaction, a state in which death was unfinished, preservation incomplete. One expert described it: she did not decompose like a human. Her body was cooked from within, crystallized from without. We weren't sure if we were looking at a corpse or nature's failed experiment. Worse still, when exposed to fresh air, the decomposition reignited. Dry, hardened tissues began to rot in real time. The wax on her face melted slowly. Grotesquely, the second death of Elizabeth I, if it could be called that, began right there in the tomb. Under the flickering glow of lanterns, no one on that team saw death as mystery anymore. To them, it had become mechanism, process, chemistry, and that was what terrified them most when sanctity is replaced by calculated rot. Professor William Hartley, the lead anatomist, recorded one line in his private journal that reads like an epitaph for monarchy itself. We believed in immortality, but we found fermentation. By Elizabeth's death was no longer an ending, it was a reconstruction of matter. A mad journey of decay underground, surrounded by steam, metal, the stench, and the dim light of natural erosion, and amid all that remained the rusted crown. The acid-stained scepter, one thing endured her fossilized heart. No longer living, no longer soulful, but indestructible, the ultimate symbol of a queen's ambition to be remembered forever. And she succeeded, not through glory, but through horror. Since that day, people no longer dreamed of royal immortality, gilded in legend. They dreamed of a clean, humble death without lead, without wax, without crystallized hearts or corpses sewn shut with coarse thread. Elizabeth changed an entire empire's view of death, not through speeches, but through a rotting body that rose from a sealed coffin. And in that shared nightmare, one final truth became clear. No throne withstands decay, no crown resists corrosion, and no one, not even Gloriana, can rewrite the laws of death.